Hello, good afternoon. My name is George Heslin and I serve as Executive Director here at New York Irish Centre. On behalf of the staff and the Board of Directors, I would like to welcome you to the American Ireland Youth Conference 2023, Creating Waves. In creating this conference, I would like to thank the Irish Government and the Northern Ireland Bureau for their kind support. I would also like to thank our media partner, Irish Central. I would like to thank the conference producers, Hannah Cecil and Ryan McNally. I would also like to welcome students from 12 universities on both sides of the Atlantic, and to thank our moderators who have given their time to this excellent conference. You're very welcome to this three-day event. Please enjoy, and I would now like to welcome Irish Consul General from New York, Ms. Helena Nolan.
Good morning and welcome to everyone participating in this second annual America-Ireland Youth Conference 2023, Creating Waves. My name is Helena Nolan. I'm the Consul General of Ireland here in New York, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this very special event. I've reviewed your programme and I'm struck by the thoughtfulness that's gone into the selection of these vital topics and timely issues. None of these challenges are going to be resolved easily or quickly. Only by listening to all perspectives and by sharing best practices will we arrive at impactful responses. And that's where your participation comes in. You're gathered for this conference because of your exceptional expertise and insights. As advocates, educators and policymakers, you're all undertaking important work to identify and promote effective solutions to these challenges. This America-Ireland Youth Conference offers the hope of synergy, the potential to multiply the impact of your efforts by sharing your experiences and by learning from one another. This weekend is also about connecting people to one another to form partnerships and friendships that will endure well beyond this conference. So we count on you as young leaders to build on the transatlantic partnership between Ireland and the United States at this pivotal moment. I'd like to especially acknowledge George Heslin for his vision in first organising this event 1 year ago and for spearheading it into its second year, and Ryan McNally for his role as the conference's producer. Thank you. I wish you all the best of luck in your efforts and your work this weekend, and I want to thank all those involved in making this year's America-Ireland Youth Conference a reality. Buin sult as an accord speisialta seo. Gur míle maith agaibh.
I'm Andrew Elliott, Director of the Northern Ireland Bureau here in Washington, D.C., sending greetings to all of you that are involved in the America-Ireland Youth Conference 2023. What a fantastic event, what a great opportunity it is to connect across the Atlantic, and I was so pleased to see many of the Bureau's partner organisations involved: Queen's University Belfast, Ulster University, the Washington Ireland Programme, Mitchell Scholars and many more. Fantastic to be able to support this event alongside the Government of Ireland and other supporters, and wish everyone well as you debate and discuss all the really interesting issues, such as the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, reproductive rights and climate change. Have a great time, everyone. Enjoy.
Welcome to Day 3 of the second annual America-Ireland Youth Conference, Creating Waves. We are your conference coordinators, Hannah Cecil
and Ryan McNally. This weekend, our young panelists will be tackling urgent and global topics. Today's panel discussion is reproductive rights across the US and the island of Ireland.
Almost 1 year ago, the United States Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, a 1973 ruling which legalized abortion. Even with almost 2 months' notice due to a leaked draft of the Supreme Court's opinion, Congress failed to codify the right to abortion, meaning once Roe v. Wade was overturned, it was left up to individual states to decide the fate of millions of people.
With each passing bill, the people of the United States find themselves in a similar position to the Irish in 1983, when the 8th Amendment of the Irish Constitution was passed, making abortion illegal in nearly all circumstances, including cases of rape and incest. However, it was overturned in 2018 with the highest voter turnout thus far in any Irish constitutional referendum.
Citizens of Northern Ireland are still on their own journey towards full reproductive rights, with decisions being taken out of local ministers' hands and passed in the British Parliament in 2020. However, it is still heavily restricted, and people seeking to have abortions continue to travel outside Northern Ireland to access the care they need.
Here to moderate today's panel is co-director and producer of the 8th a feature documentary about the historic repeal of the 8th Amendment, Aideen Kane.
Good afternoon. My name is Aideen Kane. I am a middle-aged white woman with red hair and I'm wearing glasses. And I'm calling in today from Queens, New York, the ancestral home of the Lenape people. I'm delighted to moderate our session today, and thank you very much to the conference organizers for putting together such an incredible panel of academics and activists across Ireland and the US. Our discussion today is about healthcare. Reproductive rights and reproductive justice is healthcare. Reproductive healthcare is a divisive issue. It's not actually about the healthcare. It's used as a wedge issue to gain political power. Historically, also major religions have tried to limit women's reproductive rights. And these types of actions have caused a serious absence of vital research and funding for reproductive healthcare. It's been shown in both Ireland and the US and all over the world that culture is actually more progressive than the politics. For example, in the current difficult time we are here in the US with reproductive healthcare, it's been consistently shown that the American people, over 65%, are in fact in favor of reproductive rights and reproductive justice. Unfortunately, that is not reflected in the political reality, where currently over half the states have abortion bans in place or about to be enacted. We've just recently come out of that in Ireland, and we have abortion access. We're still dealing with some issues there, but at least it is in a more progressive place in the US today. The panel I'm introducing you today are all working in these areas tirelessly. It's not easy work and it's constant and it's not always rewarded. But today I would really like to celebrate them and the work, but at the same time acknowledging the legal and political framework that they've inherited. So I'd like to bring on the panel. And we have the panel. So the first person I'd like to introduce you to today is Ciara O'Flynn. Ciara is a final year student studying at the University of Limerick. Ciara's studying at the University of Cork. And she leads Any Time of the Month, a social enterprise which alleviates period poverty and stigma through an array of initiatives in communities across Ireland and the UK. And she's had some great successes that I'm hoping she'll tell us more about. We then have Holland. Caitlin is a political science and government student. She's studying in Ireland at the moment. She's deeply interested in the issue of reproductive rights. She's an award-winning activist, and in high school and secondary school, she was very involved with campaigns to educate students about LGBTQ issues. Coming today from Baltimore is Marcella Labellarte. She's a student at the University of Baltimore, the School of Law currently. Prior to law school, Marcy worked at the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, working with several committees there, helping to develop policy recommendations on abortion and contraception, breastfeeding, trauma-informed care, Medicaid expansion, and reproductive health care for incarcerated people. Welcome, Marcy. We have calling in from Chicago today, Mohsenzadeh. She's a graduate of Emory University, studying neuroscience and behavioral biology and ethics. She is the co-founder and CEO of the nonprofit Her Drive. With Her Drive, Alexa and her team have led the distribution of over 1.1 million period and hygiene products globally, including 45 states across the US, the UK, Canada, and Mexico. They've been doing this work since 2020. They've been recognized as one of the 50 period heroes nationwide. And Her Drive is partnering with Always and Walmart this year to distribute 50,000 period products to people in need in Georgia, Illinois, and Louisiana. You're all very welcome. And I would like to start by congratulating you all for the extraordinary work that you've been doing and the achievements to date. And I will sit by and watch all of the work that you all do going forward. And I've shared a little bit about your academic careers and some of the advocacy work, and I'd like you to tell us all a little bit more about that, but starting with what inspired you to be involved and what drives you to keep going. And I'll start with Alexa.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aideen. I really appreciate it. So we started Her Drive in 2020, right in the midst of the pandemic. And I think the reason that we were inspired to get involved is because a lot of times when people think about period poverty, their first thought is that it primarily impacts the houseless population. But there are a lot of other hidden victims of this issue that I think were overlooked over the course of the pandemic, especially. So the reason why we decided to create a new organization instead of partnering with existing ones is because we primarily focus on Indigenous communities, low-income students, and immigrant detainees, because these are three populations that were not getting serviced in this movement as much as I guess we were hoping. And I think what drives us forward is how much people are willing to get involved. So our primary way of marketing this movement is through social media. And there are people of all ages, primarily high school students and college students, that are so driven to support this movement that it's great to see how many people are empowered by this issue. And it's a lot easier to get involved than I think people may expect, because service work is not as daunting when we present it in a way that's like new and fresh and young.
Thank you very much, Alexa. And Ciara, I'll ask the same question to you. What inspired you to get involved in the work that you're doing, and what motivates you to keep going?
Yeah, I just want to absolutely congratulate Alexa on everything that she's doing. I'm sitting here smiling as I'm listening to it. Like, it's just so like rewarding to hear that that's work going on in the US and across other parts of the world. So Alexa, just congratulations on everything you're doing. It just warms my heart. I suppose what has inspired me is often some people kind of skew their face when I say this, but I was always told that I can be the change, and that if I don't like something, then, you can be the change, you can fix that. And it always felt very kind of out of reach until I went into my first year of college, and I kind of realized, there was this whole issue around menstruation and access to period products and access to information and education as well. And when I had this kind of thought in my first year of college, I kind of started thinking about my whole, academic career and my whole life. And I was in an all-girls secondary school in Ireland, which is very common. I know a lot of international people are like, what? So there was only girls. And I rarely remember being taught about menstruation. I never, ever asked anyone for a period product if I needed it. It was very shone upon. And it was really like just this stigma and this subject that no one was allowed to talk about. So when I kind of started realizing this issue within my life, it made me think, well, what's the issue for other people? And I suppose that's kind of how I got involved in Time in the Month. And it was just, I wanted to create a space for people where they could talk about menstruation and where they could be educated. And a lot of the work we've done with schools, it's heartwarming, but it's also heartbreaking, because you actually see that the root of all the problem is like not having education. It's not telling people the basic things. So I suppose that's inspired me. It's just, I want to create a better future for those, who come after me. And at the end of the day, I always think to myself, like 14-year-old Ciara would be extremely thankful for all of this. And I suppose that's what keeps me going. And I don't want that life for a daughter or anyone else of mine. So yeah, that's kind of what inspires me and motivates me to keep fighting the fight. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you very much, Ciara. That was absolutely lovely. Marcy, can you tell us a little bit about your inspiration and motivation?
Sure. So I grew up pretty Irish Catholic. And I actually was pretty deeply involved in the pro-life movement with half of my family. And that changed very dramatically for me in high school. And ultimately, I have just come to be very passionate about bodily autonomy, especially for people that have a lot more barriers because of their identities, their marginalized identities, where they live, what zip code they're in. Obviously Dobbs has kind of renewed a fire in my belly about all of this, but Roe was also never, ever enough for what we deserve. And so I'm very passionate about ensuring that we all have access to abortion care and contraception that we desperately need. I also am very interested in advancing disability justice. I am a disabled person. And when it comes to abortion care, or just sexual and reproductive health care in general for disabled people, the United States is really, really lacking. And the rest of the world too, but I know a little bit more about the US.
Thank you very much, Marcy. And finally, we'll come to Caitlin. Tell us a little bit about your inspiration and motivation, Caitlin. And you started it young, way back in secondary school.
Yeah, well, I've been a queer rights activist for as long as I can remember. Once I got into secondary school, I was surrounded by a very Catholic, old Irish mentality. And I realized that there was a great stigma around people's identities and how they wanted to live. So I kind of started and forever believed that education is the best key to anything. So educating my fellow classmates in my school on queer rights, queer acceptance, and queer being was the best way to minimize and get rid of the stigma. And it did work. The school I did attend and schools around now have pride clubs, and they celebrate the idea of people being LGBTQ+. And that is what drove me to reproductive rights. Reproductive rights and queer rights always overlap when it comes, especially in Ireland and America. You can see now that due to the reduction of reproductive rights in America, queer people are also being affected. And with the introduction of rights in Ireland, you can see greater access. What keeps me going, I say, is there's still a lack of education on everything. Promoting knowledge and information on all these services is the best way to, as Ciara said earlier, get rid of the stigma, and is the best way to improve people's lives. So yeah.
Thank you very much. And it's interesting, stigma has come up about 3 times in nearly all of your answers. And, if you think about it, our reproductive health begins with menstruation generally. It's kind of the first step. And unfortunately, I think for the majority of us, and it seems to be borne out in what you're saying, Ciara, your experiences, and Alexa, that it's generally not a very positive beginning. It's not necessarily, a celebration, and it's surrounded in secrecy and shame and stigma and hiding the sanitary products. And, you've all experienced this, and we've all experienced that. And so ultimately it's a framework for the rest of reproductive health care and how society deals with reproductive health care. And so it's long past time that should change. And given that 2 of you today on this morning's panel are actively involved in that area, my first question, and I'll throw it to both of you actually, because your experiences are different, is what is period poverty? And Lex, will I start with you?
So the way that I think about period poverty is that it's kind of twofold. On the one hand, it is the lack of access to basic menstrual hygiene products. And on the other hand, it's a lack of access to education about your body and periods. And as Ciara was describing, that's very common also in the US, because curriculums don't necessarily touch that until you're in middle school. And for a lot of people, they've already begun menstruating for 1 to 3 years by that point. So it's not helpful when you're already 3 years into dealing with something that's so foreign to you.
Ciara?
Yeah, I think I would just have to reiterate what Alexa has just said. I always think of period poverty as this spider web. Like of course it's, the inability to access period products, but it's also that, like, if you're, in a situation where you're struggling to access products, you're probably in a situation where you haven't got a good education, or like you are not really understanding what's in your body. And Aideen, I just kind of want to touch on something that you brought up a few moments ago about like how we view menstruation. And I also think that's a big part of period poverty. Like, my mom kills me for saying this, but I remember I was 13, I got my period, and I cried for days because I was like, I don't want this to happen to me. I'm different now, I'm older. People are gonna look at me different. I'm automatically not the girl I was. And I viewed that so negatively. And it was just this awful thing. And, like it's just, I think it's all a spider web. I think it's all intertwined. And yeah, it's not just an inability to access products, definitely.
It's a framework. And Ciara, how would you like to have been? How would you have liked that first moment to be?
I mean, I would have liked to have been like, okay, I mean, first of all, I would have liked to have been calm, but that's very like uncharacteristic of me to be calm ever. But I think I would have liked to have just taken a breath and said, okay, this has happened. And then I would have liked to, have had somewhere to turn to or have someone to turn to. And I have a great relationship with my family, so fortunately. But I think I would have liked as well to be able to turn to friends, to be like, this has happened to me. I would have liked to been able to go into school and know that if something was going wrong or if I was feeling a bit uncomfortable or, whatever, I could talk to a teacher, but I didn't have any of that. And like Alexa just said, like I got my period in like secondary school, so high school in the US, but like so many kids were getting them at 9, 10, 11, and like we didn't hear a hint of it until we were all maybe 12. So I do think that's something that we need to pay attention to as well, that, people are menstruating at a much younger age now. So it's really, as you just said, framework. It's time to change our opinion on it, for sure.
And I mean, some of the statistics are actually huge, like they were damning. I mean, Alexa, I think I read somewhere that like 1 in 5 in the US are struggling to afford period products or have missed school or missed, events because of lack of access. Can you talk about that a little bit, those statistics?
Yeah. So in the US, there's about 500 million people who struggle to have access to period products or hygiene facilities. And then within that metric, there's almost 17 million people who menstruate who live in poverty. And within that, 2/3 of that 17 million can't afford period products. So it's sort of like it breaks down, but that's a pretty significant number. And that issue is exacerbated in rural areas in the US, especially because at least I'm knowledgeable about Indigenous communities, and on reservations, those period products, like one pack of of pads, for example, can cost $14 to $15 on a reservation, whereas like in an urban area, that would be half the price. And so not only do you have like barrier of access, but you also have barrier of cost, which makes it really difficult in areas that it's already an issue.
And Ciara, what are the statistics you've been seeing in your work in Ireland and the UK?
So from any time in the month's work, we found that 1 in 3 college students, so university students, are struggling to access period products. It's 1 in 2 for secondary school students, which is just like horrifying. And like, when you say 1 in 2 secondary school students, I know from my work, I often get this kind of dismissal reaction where people are like, oh, but, and I'm like, no, but like 1 in 2, like that's a really large number. And I think it kind of just highlights that it's not just an issue for, people who are like in real, like precarious situations, that it's an issue for everyone. And I think we need to learn that, because something that I often hear as well, or we've heard in our work, is that like, oh, period poverty doesn't affect Ireland. And like we've faced this a lot from politicians and policymakers, that this isn't an Irish issue. It's 100% an Irish issue. I think as well that kind of reaction does intertwine with our perception of reproductive rights, women's health, all that kind of a thing. And I suppose that is because of our decorated past. But yeah, it's insane in Ireland as well.
Yeah, I was surprised when I looked at the work of your organization. Marcy, I just want to give you an opportunity if you wanted to join in the discussion or any thoughts that are coming up for you on this.
Oh, sure. I mean, I would say that I have very similar experiences, at least growing up, with the stigma and the sort of shame of experiencing periods. I went to Catholic school, so when it was kind of time to have like that talk, we were split into different classrooms by gender, and there were, admittedly kind of weird conversations about, what periods were, what you should do about it. There's also in the US, and especially in like Christian communities, very problematic views about using tampons, because some people believe, if a tampon can affect your hymen, then, you can essentially lose your virginity to a tampon. So there's a lot of very pervasive views in the United States around that, which is super problematic. But I really echo everything that everybody else has said so far.
Caitlin, what's coming up for you here? What are you thinking?
Yeah, I experienced the same type of secondary school. I went to a primary school where there was like less than 10 of us in the class, and it was mixed. And we had to have the conversation of periods as a group of maybe less than 5 girls with the lads, comfortable asking them questions. So girls like me went through secondary school and barely knew what was happening in their bodies. And of course, there was a Catholic undertone to everything. And there still is in primary and secondary schools today. There's a Catholic undertone, and there's an idea of like, don't ask or like, don't say anything because, you shouldn't. And it's still being seen today, but hopefully there's new legislation to change sex ed and talks around periods. So in next 2 years, we're hoping seeing reform in Irish legislation.
That's right, actually, because we've free contraception since January 1, but are there movements towards free period products in Ireland?
No.
Well, sorry, okay, I didn't mean to interrupt. I know from our work at IHM in the month, there was this like brief moment where like all the politicians were like, I hate to say this, but I often sometimes feel that, a lot of public representatives, they cling on to words and they run with it for a while. And I think period poverty became something which is so unfortunate that a lot of people were like, yeah, that's what I'm going to run with now for a while. So there was this brief moment in Irish like politics where, period poverty seemed to be making its appearance, but I think all is very quiet right now. I think there's maybe 3 public representatives that are shouting about it constantly, which is fantastic. But it's very much a buzzword for Irish politicians, yeah.
So disappointing. And I know we've touched on it, but I'd love to talk a little bit more about the actual impacts of period poverty. I mean, what does it mean for menstruating people to not have access to adequate hygiene or products? I'll start with Alexa.
I think the biggest thing is its impact on a person's sense of self and dignity, because not having access to during your time of the month, like I already am going through a lot. And so I can't even imagine dealing with having to find access to a pad and not having it, and then resorting to socks or resorting to other like unhygienic alternatives. That takes a really big toll on your mental health and also your physical health. I think people underestimate the physical health impacts of resorting to these alternatives, because it can lead to infection, it can become very severe, and then you sort of have this seemingly minor issue that's expanded into something very expensive and very costly, and that becomes much more longer term than during your period. So I don't know if Ciara or Caitlin have other things to add.
Yeah, I think I could absolutely echo everything. I think as well, it's just like, it makes you feel like, it makes a person feel absolutely awful. Like, and I think like that, your sense of self, like if you were thinking to yourself, no, I can't afford to buy period products, so I'm going to use other things, then, like you're belittling your health. You're kind of underestimating how important your health is. And I think that carries through. And like, you know, a lot of people who menstruate are women. And I think, you know, that kind of female condition to just throw aside things that matter because of, you know, society's outlook on it all. And I think it has that undertone of like not realizing and accepting, you know, that something is important. I think it kind of has that undertone of, you know, that, like I just said, their female condition of just kind of abandoning your, I don't know, my words are jumbling, but I hope you kind of get what I'm trying to say.
You expressed it very clearly. You know, it's interesting thinking about it that, you know, it's this bodily function that is so completely normal. And there's a loss of unused cells and blood. It's rejuvenating. I mean, it is such an empowering time in our lives. And yet we see it as like, oh, got my period. Oh, I can't do anything. Oh, I'm not going to do that. Or I don't have the energy. And I mean, wouldn't it be lovely if we lived in a world where you could just put your hand up and say, hey, teach, I'm not feeling great today. Or, hey, I'm not coming into work today, but I'll log on. Like, why isn't that normal?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. But also, wow, look what I can do. I can give life, or I can make babies, or I can cleanse my own body. It's so disappointing at this stage, but I really applaud the work that you're both doing. It's absolutely extraordinary. It's much needed, and well done to both of you. So moving on then, I suppose the next piece of kind of healthcare that, you know, in terms of the reproductive world that we all seem to encounter is the contraception. And once again, it generally falls to people who menstruate to think about contraception. And there has been an amazing milestone in Ireland at the moment, as in earlier this year, as of January 1, contraception up to, I think, the age of 26, but that will be expanded later on this year, is now available completely free of charge for all those who need it, as long as they reside in Ireland. So that's something to really be applauded and an amazing moment. But one of, I think, putting that in context, in Ireland, contraception was only made illegal in 1979. You know, it's extraordinary to think about that. But one of the things, and Ciara and I were talking about this earlier, that I was amazed to find when we were doing the research for the a film on the repeal of the Eighth Amendment in Ireland, was that contraception was only banned in Ireland in the 1930s, which I just think that's absolutely extraordinary. And Ciara, I just wanted to see if you were saying that came to you even later. The history of
yeah, it did. And also as well, like divorce was only made illegal. Like you could get a divorce in the 1922 Constitution. It was hard to come by, but you could get it. So I think it all falls back to, and I don't want to sound like I'm, you know, tearing down Catholicism, but I think it does all fall down to the Irish Catholic social teaching, like the grip that the Catholic Church had on Ireland was insane. And I think, you know, everybody on this panel is very familiar with that. But like I always say, like the Catholic Church wrote our 1937 Constitution, the Constitution that we still function off today. It was hand in hand with Eamon de Valera. And I think it's very obvious in all the articles and all the legislation how involved it was and how the social teaching just found its way into every single article. And like that, like the contraception not being illegal until, you know, that constitution was there. I think it's just really telling of kind of the way society was going, and not to get like super political on it, but, you know, if you're like Ireland was coming out of British rule, it was its own functioning state. And I do feel as though like that kind of relationship it had with the Catholic Church was maybe a replacement, you know, for Britain, because how does Ireland function on its own? That's going down a whole another panel discussion. But yeah, no, I think it's absolutely crazy, but it's just very highlighting of that relationship we had with Catholicism and our views on, you know, marriage and relationship and family and things like that. So yeah.
And Marcy, you grew up in a very Catholic family, a very Catholic environment here. here in the US, can you talk about that a little bit and what an impact that had on, your own framework of politics?
Sure. Yeah, so I would say that, people may not necessarily recognize or admit it, but a large number of, Supreme Court decisions offer sort of a Irish Catholic background or sort of influence that I can easily pick up, but other people don't necessarily. But Christianity has a very, very large impact on the legal system of the United States, even though arguably it should not. But I would say that, so the Catholic Church believes that sex should only happen between a married couple, a man and a woman, and it should only be for procreative purposes. So technically, even married couples are not allowed to use condoms because the only time you should be having sex is for the purpose of procreation, thus you never need condoms. The reality of that is, I think literally 99% of sexually active people use contraception besides like natural family planning, which is the idea that you only have sex on days where you are ovulating or, not ovulating to prevent pregnancy. And it's very fascinating because I don't think necessarily most Americans understand or like see that connection, but there really is a huge influence that the church, the Pope has, and that a lot of, Christians actively want. They want the United States legal system to reflect that. And ultimately, obviously, if condoms are not realistic, then neither are birth control pills and IUDs and things like that. So it is my personal belief that now that Roe has fallen, that contraception will be sort of the next target of the pro-life movement. And, they have pretty much all but said that. So, that is a really terrifying thing. A lot of people have, after Dobbs came out, even after Trump was elected president in 2020, immediately went and got long-acting reversible contraception like IUDs, Depo-Provera. And some people might argue that, that's kind of coercive. People who may not otherwise wanted to have technology like that were forced, essentially forced to, because they didn't want their insurance to later not be able to cover birth control pills. They wanted to have that in their bodies for 5 to 10 years, if that meant, it might become illegal one day. So it's really problematic and is the next sort of platform, I think.
Absolutely right. And I think they're very, very real and valid concerns. Caitlin, growing up in a rural community, what impact did the church have on your lives? Or the Catholic Church?
I come from an area where there's actually a Protestant and Catholic church very close. So I came from a Catholic family, and we've never, I could honestly say I did not learn about contraceptive, about sex until maybe late secondary school properly, or even the start of college. I think I've been educated by my university more than I have in my 6 years of secondary school experience. Contraceptives are now not as taboo as they used to be, especially as a uni student. You can get condoms from the student union office, and you can go to student health and they will give you a prescription for any type of contraceptive a person might want without judgment, and they will listen to you and understand your healthcare perfectly. As we go through this decade and these years a lot more, it's becoming less taboo and the church is having less a hold. But it's the older generation and the people who are raised by the older generation who still have a hold on our legislation and our policy, will make it more difficult for us to progress in a healthy and a better way for the future. So the church is having less of a grip hold as it did in the past. As in our constitution, women were supposed to be in the home in our constitution, no contraceptives and no abortion. But as we go through this decade especially, we are seeing a less of a tight grip on the church by the church and more of a progression by younger people, but it's still there and especially held highly by the older generations.
I think you're absolutely right, but I did also think it was very interesting that when given the extraordinary progressive reforms that there have been in Ireland, that it was surprising the demographics of people that voted in favour of the more progressive reforms. And the older generations were not as much of a bloc as the campaigners expected them to be. And I think that was borne out. And similar to the States, it was a very interesting statistic that when the language was introduced in the Irish Constitution in 1983 to copper fasten an existing ban, it was introduced in favour 2-1. But when 35 years later, when it was voted to take that language out and actually start a framework for legislating for abortion, it was also voted in 2-1. So I do think a lot of, again, back to my earlier point, that in general, cultures are more progressive than the political and legal frameworks. And I mean, the Irish politicians all jumped on the bandwagon when they saw that this was going to pass in Ireland, but for 30 years they had kicked it to touch. Nobody was going to touch it. It was political death. So I hear you on that, but I'm proud of what Ireland did and the Irish population did, given the obstacles and the challenges they had to overcome. And as usual, there is more work to come, more work to be done, and there will always be more work to be done. But I do think that is something to take heart in. And I think the same thing with the US, despite the situation we're in right now, in certain state constitutional referenda last fall, people voted as they felt with their culture in favor, and it was surprising to a lot of the more right-wing politicians. So, but thank you for that. I think, I suppose the biggest thing on most of our agendas right now, though they are all overlapping and intersection, but the hugest thing is, I suppose, this situation here in the US, where after 50 years of having abortion rights, that's been rolled back, and some people seem to be surprised by that, but I think a lot of people working in this area actually saw this coming for a very long time, and people who were surprised, I suppose, at the general population who didn't see this coming. And as you say, Marcy, the right for abortion here in the States was based on very tenuous and not very concrete basis. So it was always there to be overturned. But before we get too deep into it, I wanted to start with you, Marcy, because I think it's an extraordinary situation that you did grow up in a very pro-life, and I would prefer the term anti-abortion or anti-reproductive rights, because there's nothing pro-life about it. But that's the term that's used a lot. But so you did grow up in a Catholic family, and you yourself were anti-abortion. And I just wanted to you to talk about that a little, and then what happened to make you question that and rethink that.
Sure. So yeah, it's a story that I love to tell, honestly. But I grew up in, my mom is Irish Catholic, very pro-life. My dad is an atheist and a physician and has performed abortions, although he did not tell me that until I was a little bit older. But I grew up with this sort of dominant view that abortion was murder, that people who performed abortions or got abortions were murderers. And I, really was led to believe that was just a universal truth. And babies needed to be saved. And, there were moments I would cry because I was devastated that all these babies were being murdered. And, that was reinforced by being in Catholic school. I was in Catholic school from kindergarten through 8th grade. So very dominant point of view. And I ended up going to a public high school, which is quite different than a Catholic high school, than a Catholic school in general. But I basically sort of stumbled upon someone when I was a freshman in high school who had just had sex the night before, hadn't used a condom, and was like in tears, terrified that they might have gotten pregnant. And like the very first thought that I had in my mind very ashamedly was like, this person's irresponsible, and if they have an abortion, they're a murderer. And I remember having that thought and just feeling disgusted with myself and being able to, pinpoint exactly where I heard that language and who told me that. And, I still very much identified as Catholic. And I just thought, that's the worst possible thing anyone could ever think or say about another person when they're when they're clearly in crisis. And I just had, sort of this euphoric moment of like, actually, the real, like, there's no way that the God that I believed in, like, would have accepted that as something that you should think of another human being. And so I immediately was just like, okay, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get you a pregnancy test. If you need an abortion, like, we'll figure it out. I immediately thought of my dad, not necessarily knowing that he had performed abortions in the past, but I was like, my dad's a doctor. Like, if we need to get you to a healthcare facility, that's just what it's going to be. And honestly, I just have never turned back, totally radicalized from there. But it was very, I don't really identify so much as religious or spiritual now, but at the moment it felt like, honestly, religious intervention, divine intervention, because I just realized, if someone was coming to me in someone I didn't even know was so desperate that they would come to me at a time when they really needed support, and the only thing that I could do was turn them away and judge them, that was no reflection of what I wanted to be as a human being and a Christian. And so, that was basically it. And I just continued to sort of challenge my ideas of why I thought abortion was a problem. I continued to challenge my thoughts about when abortion should be illegal or not illegal. I believe abortion bans are all bad. I don't believe that there is any moment in pregnancy that it should be banned. And I just continue to check in with myself and make sure that at the end of the day, I believe in, bodily autonomy. What a person wants to do with their body is what they want to do. And we should live in a society where we support that every step of the way. If someone wants to be a mother as a teenager, then we need to have supports for them. If they don't want to ever have children, then we need to support them too.
Thank you very much. Alexa, as I mentioned earlier, that even though those rights have been here or were here in the US, access has been an issue for communities for a very long time. And I think some of the communities that you're working in with your organization would have found it very difficult to access abortions. I wonder, and there would have been some activism around that, but it was like they were shouting fire for a very long time, but nobody heard, or at least mainstream reproductive activist movements didn't seem like they heard. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I don't have as much of a background understanding how the specific populations that we serve are affected in the context of abortion, but I know, at least from direct interactions with the people that we've served, there's just a lack of awareness because their proximity to the issue is not as close, because they're kind of, especially, for example, immigrant detainees. They're so under the radar for a lot of things, but contraceptive access and abortion is probably at the bottom tier of those things. For reservations and Indigenous communities, location plays a really significant role in the way that they're protected under the law, as well as their ability to even access these services. I think the interesting thing about the US as well as Ireland and some of the similarities is just because the law doesn't provide that coverage doesn't mean that it's not, these abortions and this access to contraception isn't still happening. It's just happening in a much more dangerous way. And that issue is amplified when these communities are already hidden and under the radar in that sort of way.
Hear your thoughts on that, the similarities between Ireland, possibly pre-repeal of the 8th, and the US.
Yeah, I think Ireland's attitude to abortion, I'm going to say pre repeal the eighth, but I would categorize it as now as well. Like, our view on abortion is very, very awful. It's strange. It's, it's hard. Like, it's just weird. Like, I know from my own kind of knowledge that, like, you could get an abortion in Ireland, legally under these really, like, strict categories. And something that sticks out for me is that, like, pre-repeal the eighth, a person could get an abortion, like, if only her life was in severe danger. But, like, the threshold of severe danger was so high that so many women were, like, not getting abortions. They were traveling to the UK. Their health was so affected. Like, there's this one case for me that I think it's the X case, if I'm right, in Ireland, and it just sticks out for me that a young girl had to say, my life is in danger, and, like, her life was in danger, and that was enough then. And I think the way that Ireland, puts it on such a high threshold is so dangerous. And I think it has shaped our view of abortion now, in that you can only get an abortion in extreme cases. But, like, if somebody needs or wants an abortion, that's that. It's them, it's their body, it's their rights. And I think that's something that we pre-repeal the eighth, but also after repeal the eighth, we can't connect with. And even now in Ireland, like, there's still this, like, presence on social media and in kind of circles and dialogue that somebody who's getting an abortion must really need it. Somebody who's getting an abortion is getting an abortion, case closed. Like, you don't need to list out, well, this really bad thing happened to me, or, like, I was in this situation. Like, there's no need for, like, hypotheticals. I think it's access to healthcare, and nobody questions why you go to get painkillers. Why are we questioning why somebody's accessing another type of healthcare? And I think that's something in Ireland and in the US, I suppose, as well, that we need to learn to connect with and reason with, for sure.
It's disappointing to hear that still prevails, given the fact that we currently have a right to abortion in Ireland up to 12 weeks with no questions asked. Obviously, 3-day waiting period and those things, but still, that's disappointing. Caitlin, would that be similar for you? Would you be feeling the same sort of lack of just being able and freedom to say, well, I'm having an abortion or I'm getting an abortion and it's available to me, it's my right?
Yeah, like, of course, there's still the stigma around the service, and Ciara put it perfectly. Like, it's accessing healthcare. Why should we have such a precise reason to access a simple form of healthcare? I feel like, as Ireland, the European Union, 25 out of 27 countries legalize abortion access, but, like, Ireland has very strict parameters, makes it criminal in some cases, makes it legal in others. But it seems to be this high idea of that it's like life or death, like you only should access it at the most dire time of your life. And, like, that should not be around there. You should not have to justify or fear for yourself just to access basic healthcare. And I think as we educate people more on this area, then it will become less of a fearful or dramatic form of healthcare when it is simple and should be accessed by all.
And doesn't require any legislation. We don't need any laws for healthcare. Marcy, I want to come back to something you and I talked about earlier in the week, and something you said in your previous answer about questioning and continue to question, which I think is really important. And it's what we tried to do in our film about the Irish abortion situation. And you recently completed a paper on disability-based selective abortion, autonomy or eugenics. And I know you're very involved in this, the intersection of disability rights and anti-abortion activism. And I'd love for you to share a little bit of your work in that paper, and please.
Sure, yeah. So I basically came up with the idea just because obviously my history with the pro-life movement, I'm aware sort of a lot of the messaging that goes on about needing to protect disabled people from sometimes themselves, sometimes from people who are seeking abortions. And there is just a really unique sort of relationship that the disability community has with the pro-life movement, in beliefs about certain things, including abortion. Selective abortion is particularly interesting. So it's the idea that you're getting an abortion based on it really about sex, gender, race, and like based on like fetal anomalies or genetic conditions. So, there's kind of an overlap in this idea that there's some discomfort that people have with the idea, or a lot of people have with the idea of having an abortion because the fetus has indications that they will be born with a disability, that they will be born with a condition that will lead them to be disabled over time, that their quality of life will be affected. And there's a lot of the pro-life movement really holds it up, honestly, as sort of an emotional trigger to induce sort of support of the pro-life movement of, we need to protect disabled babies. But obviously, once disabled babies are born, we don't really care about that. Or, how we don't really support them as they move into adulthood. But one of the really interesting things is the truth is there's a lot of valid concerns about, abortion being used as a eugenics tool. The United States has historically and very recently used sterilization as a tool against disabled people, against people with criminal histories, against people of color. Some of the communities we've talked about today, Indigenous populations, Puerto Rican women, Latino women, Black women were forced to be sterilized, sometimes without their consent. And it led to, a drastic reduction in their ability to reproduce. And that was a very purposeful decision by the United States government, and remains a very purposeful decision to affect the reproductive capacity of people of color. There's also a lot of concerns about sort of the eugenics origins of abortion, such as Planned Parenthood. Margaret Sanger is a controversial figure, to be honest. In many ways, we appreciate her for how she pioneered the birth control movement, how she opened Planned Parenthood. But there were also a lot of, overt eugenics and racism and missteps on her behalf that is often discussed when people talk about, should I trust Planned Parenthood? Should I trust what they say? And Planned Parenthood has come to recently address that, but it was really the disabled community that really pushed them to say, like, you need to be held, you need to have some accountability here. Like Margaret Sanger really believed in eugenics. She really believed that at some point birth control was necessary to prevent disabled people from having children, and thus disabled people from being born. And so ultimately it's, sort of a question of there are lots of opportunities for abortion and contraception to be used as a eugenics tool. I don't think that they are inherently tools of eugenics, but definitely can be. But ultimately, abortion access, contraception access is very, very fundamental to bodily autonomy. And as I mentioned before, in order to really support disabled people, we need to be supporting them from pregnancy through adulthood and being elderly. We need to make sure that we're supporting people wherever they are. And if people do not want to have a child, their motivations are not really our business. We would like to make sure that if people want to have a child and it will be difficult for them financially, we'd really like to make sure that it was not difficult financially. But the American health system is what it is, and has the barriers that it has, and those are, don't seem to be going away anytime soon. And so I would say that, there are some absolute justified concerns about how the government specifically uses healthcare to discriminate and ultimately kill disabled people. But abortion and contraception is just a fundamental need for the disabled community to control their health, to control their lives. And so it's a really complicated question, but I'm really glad that I got to learn more about, the ideas that everybody sort of has.
Thank you very much. Amazing work. Alexa, I see you nodding and nodding. Did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it can be really frustrating because there's absolutely no standardization of paid leave in the US or Medicaid coverage, postpartum Medicaid coverage on a state-by-state level. And so for this anti-abortion movement to put forth these values of the baby's life and quality of life, and then not even comprehensively cover the back end of that post-birth is really frustrating to see. And I echo a lot of the things that Marcella said, was beautifully said. And then I think the other thing that's frustrating is when you go into the nitty-gritty of the state-by-state laws. I went to college in Georgia, for example, which is not a great state in terms of abortion access. And the ways in which the text sort of attempts to make it as difficult as possible to have access to contraception, and they manipulate the timing of certain appointments or having to get parental consent within a specific time frame. And if you don't have access to transportation, or you don't have certain resources where you're not in a position where you can tell your parent or legal guardian about the situation, it makes it nearly impossible, even if they have that 6-week time frame. And for a lot of people, 6 weeks is not even enough to be aware that you're pregnant. And so it comes through very clearly how intentional it is to make this process nearly impossible for people.
No, I think both of you, you're bringing up a lot there. And I do think the stark reality in the US is how high the maternal mortality rates are, and like multiplied by 4 for communities of color. And so, it's a question, is it nearly safer if it's a crisis pregnancy, having to be forced to go through that, given the dearth of care and proper health care that pregnant people are going to have. I mean, it is extraordinary. I do think, for such a wealthy society, the fact that there is no mandate for paid maternal leave is extraordinary. And having lived in both communities, it really is shocking, and expecting new parents to go back to work after 6 weeks and they don't even know their own name. But yeah, it's so much work to be done. It's not over. We have a couple of questions from coming in from the viewers, and thank you very much for those. And one of them jumps back to an earlier conversation, and I just thought we might get it in now because I don't want to run out of time. So the question, and I suppose it's to all of you, but probably Marcy and Alexa, and we'll start with Marcy on this. What do you make of politics in the US being controlled by Christian ideals, even though there is supposedly separation of church and state?
Yeah, I hate it. I'm not sure that there's a more complicated answer than that. It is really, really wild. There's been a lot of interesting pushback. I believe there's currently a case in Florida on behalf of a Jewish women's organization that is essentially saying that restriction of abortion violates their religious rights to have an abortion, because abortion in Judaism and in Islam is honestly quite different than in Christianity. I think it's a huge problem. I think that it is important to recognize that there are no atheists on the Supreme Court. There's probably no atheists in Congress, definitely no atheists in the presidency. And, not saying that people need to be atheists, but I think the United States is very, as much as we have separation of church and state, religion is also part of our founding. That's why we left. It's why we defected. And so as much as we have sort of that separation, it's not as much as I think people would genuinely like. That's not that required. The idea of religious freedom is very fundamental to this country, and unfortunately Christian religious freedom is more important, it seems, than anybody else. I don't really see necessarily how that will change, but I do know that people are increasingly becoming less religious, or at least not necessarily less spiritual, but less invested in like religious organizations. That seems to be what the statistics say. So I'm kind of curious, as there's a very, most of politics is old Christian white men, and sort of as we continue to phase those people out, and as we age along, how will that sort of become replaced? Is a very interesting question, but that's a decades long journey. That's not something that's going to happen tomorrow.
And Ciara, I was interested to hear you talk so much about the Catholic Church earlier, both you and Caitlin. Can you talk a little bit more about the situation in Ireland?
Yeah, like I think, like I said earlier, like I'll never try and bash, like somebody's religious belief or like faith or whatever, because even like for my own grandparents, like they are of that generation that, views Catholicism so brightly, and it's it's their place to go. And like my grandfather, he was so religious, and I think he's the one thing that provides a positive connection to Catholicism for me, because he was so involved in it, and he saw it as a positive thing. But I think we're very quick in Western countries to kind of cast a side eye to countries maybe in the Middle East, or in more southern areas that are really strongly religiously controlled. Like if we're very quick to go, ooh, but I don't think we realize how much our own faith and beliefs in Christianity and Catholicism or whatever it might be trickle into our policies, our culture, our ideals. And I think the situation in Ireland is just it's like awful. Like I keep saying that throughout this call, but like it's really awful, because like at what point does, kind of a faith allow for a certain policy or a certain way to like happen? Like that's just something I don't understand. And really going back to what I was saying a while ago, like my secondary school was fantastic, but it was a all girls Catholic institution, and I learned Catholic values. And something that Marcy said a while ago about that girl that she knew that was fearful she had an abortion, like like Marcy's thoughts are probably the thoughts that I would have had up until a few years ago, because I was so strictly controlled by this kind of Catholic culture. And of course I'm not saying it's awful, but it's not positive. Like it's not good for anybody. And I think that's something in Ireland that is still very present and that we need to kind of overcome, because as I said, like our constitution is church written, as much as it tries to maybe defer from that, not true. So yeah, I think it's a very dire situation in Ireland, but I do believe it can be better. And like phasing out that kind of old kind of style of politics and public representatives, it's coming. A change is coming, and I don't believe that we're going to be in this situation forever. I do believe people are waking up and they're smelling the daisies and they're realizing that's not right. I do believe a change is coming, and I don't think there's anything stopping anyone from being that beacon of hope or being that one voice in a room. Because like I always said, it's a conversation that once you start it, it goes from there. So yeah, dire but positive for the future.
I like to piggyback off here there. Ireland's a diverse country now. It's less Catholic. We have people from all over the world. Everyone immigrates to Ireland, and us immigrating to other countries like America. We're part of the European Union, and we are faced with 27 other countries of different religions, cultures. And I feel like as Ireland becomes more diverse, we're seeing less hold on Catholic values in our policies, and hopefully a stronger, diverse future too for the country.
Aideen, you're muted.
Thanks, Marcy. We have the Pride Parade in Queens today, so it's coming into the apartment. I think that there's a critical piece of it in Ireland, in that the Catholic Church is so involved in education. And even though they're not funding education anymore, it's something in the high 90% of schools that are run by the Catholic Church or have a board of directors that's headed by a member of the Catholic Church. Despite, and it goes back to that they had started the schools and they own the lands and there's leases, but it's going to be a long battle, a very long battle. And it was part of the reason why we moved back to the States from Ireland, because I had my children in a small rural Catholic school and they were absolutely wonderful. But ultimately, when I challenged the teachers, if they taught religion, these were, young teachers, if they taught religion as a fact, or taught Catholicism as a fact or as a belief system, and they had never questioned themselves. So it was just getting harder and harder for me to diffuse what the children were coming home with. But yeah, it's schools are critical, because that's such a huge part of, shaping the minds of society and education in general, but it starts at 4. Yeah. Alexa, you have a wonderful goal, which I read about, which I really was fascinated about and want to unpack a little bit more. So your goal is to integrate feminist cross-cultural perspectives into our scientific and legal awareness. I'd love you to expand on that powerful and important goal.
Sure. So I think I started working towards this goal in the last 2 years of my college experience, because I became introduced to the work of Dr. Debelina Roy, and she's a feminist neuroscientist. And her work is very profound because it talks about deconstructing the hierarchies that we see in science and understanding the way that our knowledge of gender and sex differences in neuroscience inform our research practices. And so when I started working with her, I think I wanted to find a way where I could bridge my service work with her drive, with my academic work in neuroscience, because the two seemed very disconnected. And I think what I realized in my last year was that a lot of women's health policies are deeply informed by research, or they should be deeply informed by research, but they aren't, because those lines of communication haven't necessarily been established. And if they have been established, science has become so politicized in the US that it's almost impossible for one side to listen to the other. And so I think by integrating a feminist science perspective and also integrating various cross-cultural identities into these conversations, it allows us to expand what we think of as equity and inclusion. And it also allows us to expand the ways in which our identity, our health, and our agency are all intertwined. And that's a very abstract, I think I'm describing this in a very abstract way, but to ground it a little bit, I guess, having greater representation on the policy level, establishing more lines of communication between coalitions and group leaders and policymakers. I know Caitlin mentioned that there's not that much diversity in Ireland, as there's not that much diversity in the US in terms of who's creating this legislation. And it's frustrating because it's weird to see white men create policies about our bodies because they're not informed on a very deep level about this personal experience. So hopefully I answered your question, but it's a big objective.
And it's inspirational, and I have no doubt, but you will make great strides with it for sure. We have another question from the audience, but it's a great question, and keep them coming, but it's very broad, and I was hoping to make it a little bit more specific by going around and talking to each of you. But first, I wanted to go back to the organizations that Alexa and Ciara have set up. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how much work that has taken alongside being a full-time student or, being part of your families, and how you funded that work. And I'll start with Ciara.
Yeah, like I think it's incredibly difficult to, like it's really tough work to be the voice in the room who's going, periods. Or like, like I've often, like when I got involved in any time of the month, and it's not just me, it's a group of fantastic girls, and like we all kind of face this, like, we're encouraging people to speak and we're encouraging, change. But I, hand on my heart, can tell you that there was moments where I was like, what am I doing? Like I'm in a society where, like, well, I won't even have a conversation with my father about menstruation. What am I trying to do? Encouraging the masses to change their opinion. And it was like very daunting. And it was like, oh God, like, is the change going to come? But I think, once you see that tiny nugget of positivity, or once you kind of have a conversation with one young girl and they walk away and they go, thanks. And you're like, oh, that's what keeps you going and that's what it's all about. But I do think it's incredibly difficult. And I think as a young student, like I'm only 21 years of age, like it's really hard because there's this label as well that students are just reckless and they, they're living life to the fullest. And, that's great. Most of them are. But I think there's not a lot of recognition as well for those young students who are, trying to do their best to, change what they know. And like I see it a lot, like the attitude towards young people working towards difference or working in service kind of industries is very low. And I think in Ireland there's a lot more respect for people who are in traditional roles, like a lot more respect for engineers. And I'm not going to say engineers are awful or anything, but like engineers, nurses, these very like stereotypical roles. And I think, there's not a lot of love given to the people who are trying to create a better, more equal, sustainable future. And like in terms of funding, like it's funny. That's all I'm gonna say, like you're asking people to support you and be kind to you and donate to you, and it's really hard as well, and like living crisis and all this and the cost of things rising. But I think it's definitely lonely at sometimes. 100%. It's scary, it's lonely, but it's so rewarding, and I don't think I'd ever go back. And like if you gave me the option to be fully funded or else like struggle but get your moments of hope, I would 100% say struggle, because it's at the end of the day just wanting to be the change.
It's beautiful. Alexa?
I echo everything that Ciara said. I think it was helpful to start the organization during a time when everything was sort of shut down, because that could be my sole priority. But now that things are kind of back up and running in the US, people start to lose care because there's a high saturation of a million other social justice issues. And if it's not right in front of their face, and if it doesn't catch their attention in the 5 seconds that they look at it, then they're not going to support the issue. And so that can be really frustrating. But I think I've been rewarded by how unexpected our success has been through social media and how young our volunteer base is. It's really nice to be able to work with people who are my age and just talk very casually and have this personal working relationship with each volunteer, even though everything is conducted remotely. So every meeting that I've had over the past 3 years has been just like this with the volunteers, and I've never met any of them in person. And yet we've been able to develop really strong relationships with each other, and people keep coming back year after year wanting to host drives in their community. So that's the rewarding part, but I wouldn't say it doesn't come with a lot of struggle and prioritization balancing it as a student.
Yeah, extraordinary hard work. And I'm sure tough to keep going at times and tough to get up the next day and start it all over again. Caitlin, you experienced something similar in your work with the LGBTQ communities?
Yeah, mine was mostly my own work, but when I was doing my project, which I have kind of taken a step back from due to starting college, I got a lot of hate, a lot of, people saying, why are you talking about this? You shouldn't. So, backlash is definitely a thing that demotivates you, but, you got to push through, you got to keep going, because if you don't educate, you don't make change, you won't get anywhere.
Marcy, talk to me about it. I know we talked earlier about inspiration and motivation, but on those tough days, and you find the work hard, what do you draw on?
Yeah, that's a good question. Desperation, I guess. I find myself very motivated by a crisis mindset. I was very inspired by this work before Dobbs, but especially after Dobbs, I feel particularly called to offer a more radical perspective, to be honest. I really am, pressuring people to reevaluate, do you want to be pro-choice or do you want to be pro-abortion? What is the reason behind, what do you think about viability? Do you think that's where abortion should stop or start? At what point should those things start? I think that, I really want to push people to really think about the idea that this bodily autonomy is absolute. Like our decisions, the government's decisions should have just absolutely no place in this. And, my opinions about your body should have no effect on your healthcare. So I carry it with me all the time. Because I'm disabled, I interact with the healthcare system on a frequent basis. So it's just never not top of mind for me, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So a question that came from one of the audience is, what can people do? What can individuals do to reclaim the lost rights? So I'm going to ask each of you to take a minute and think about how people can help and what they should be doing. And I want you to specifically highlight your own organizations and make sure you say the name fully and website, but also, any advice or guidance you can give them to connect locally. I will start with Alexa. You seem to be starting, but we'll go for you. So again, make sure you tell us a little bit about your organization. So what can people do?
I think the easiest way to get involved without feeling super overwhelmed is to start local. And so research in your area what organizations exist specifically for reproductive justice, as well as for period poverty. As far as our organization, we're called Her Drive, and I think our website is herdrive.org, but it could be something else. You'll find out by looking it up. And I think that provides a really easy platform to get started because we accept volunteers every month, and you fill out the application, and then we provide you with a whole slew of resources to help you get started and host your own drive in your community. And then you donate those products locally to an organization of your choice. But that whole process is guided by us. So I think that's a nice way to, get involved and get your hands dirty and then become familiar with the issues that exist in your own community.
Thank you very much. So everybody has to look up Her Drive and get on the mailing list and follow. I'm assuming you've got Instagram, or what are your social media? Instagram, Her Drive, and follow and spread the word. And I think really good advice. Find out what's going on in your own local community in any of the issues and the topics that we've talked about today. Caitlin, what would you like people to do? How do you think they should get in help?
Well, if I'm going to take anything from my own personal experience in the ideas of starting small, as well, I would look to a teacher you trust, and maybe if you gather information on periods or start a resource or see if you can get donations for your secondary school. There's a secondary school in Ireland at the moment that made the news for starting a free period product campaign among their classmates, so they wouldn't have the stress of period poverty. But honestly, educate yourself, start educating those around you, and it'll become less daunting and stigmatized as time goes on, and build your way up from there.
Thank you very much. And do you know the name of that school in Ireland? I did read about it, but I don't remember the name. Or take a minute and find it just so we can give them a good shout out. Good for them. Marcy.
Sure. So I would say number one, definitely vote. Number two is, because this is the United States, also vote with your money. A lot of people, I would obviously, you know, encourage, if you want to support Planned Parenthood or NARAL or other national organizations, to do so. But actually the people that most need it are local abortion funds. They're actually taking the brunt of what people need. So I'm in Baltimore. The Maryland Abortion Fund is Baltimore Abortion Fund. You can actually look up like the ones that are closest to you on the National Network of Abortion Funds website. And I would really, you know, don't just focus on your state, also focus on sort of, you know, the geography of what's happening. So Maryland is one of like the most protective states before, you know, how do I say this? Maryland is like where everybody sort of from the South is going, because we're like, us to Maine is very protected, but everybody below us is not. That being said, I would also, you know, obviously this is a predominantly white panel. Women of color were, you know, created the concept of reproductive justice. I would really recommend looking into the organization Sister Song, which is a Southern-based group of women of color, specifically Black women, who sort of lead these initiatives. A lot of the United States sort of, you know, looks down or poorly upon the South because the politicians, you know, really dominate the conversation, but we really need to support the people that are there that need abortions. We cannot just let them, you know, go. We need to support them in every way. And I think that really starts out with listening to what people of color are saying is their lived experience. And I would also say, if you want to learn more, to go on to the Guttmacher Institute. It's really great, you know, policy website, gives a lot of data and statistics, which really helps me. I use it very heavily for my paper. And I would just say, you know, just give where you can, talk about it. You know, don't be afraid to say the word abortion to anybody. You know, the more that we can reduce that stigma. This is healthcare. You know, it's normal as an appendectomy. It's safer than an appendectomy. And we need to make sure that we are just doing this in every part of our lives.
I love it. Thank you very much. So normalize, donate locally, and specifically to communities of which this is their lived experience. Thank you very much. And I echo the Guttmacher Institute. They're extraordinary, and it's global research, not just US. An extraordinary group of individuals for sure. And so, Ciara,
the advice that I kind of have is something that I've said for a long time now. Just talk to people. I really think that like we can change our perceptions on things and the way things work if we just have conversations. And I think this is something that, you know, all kind of aspects of life we shy away from. And I think it's the root of all issues, is not having that space to talk about things. In any time of the month, the organization that I work with, the main message is to just have the conversation, no matter how awkward it makes you feel. Like I have many funny anecdotes of talking to people, and, you know, there's a fire burning in me where I'm like, get me out. But it's worth it in the end, because that person now has all this wealth of knowledge about peer poverty, or not even a wealth. They just might know something new about even menstruation or periods. And the knock-on effect of that is huge. They're going to tell somebody in their circle, who's going to tell somebody in their circle. And it's just, you know, like you're creating a change in the most informal way as possible. And I think that's something that I'd really recommend. Of course, obviously get yourselves into awkward situations like that. Like, just be in situations where, you know, like you don't want to talk about something, but you're talking about something. So that's something that I'd recommend. And in any time of the month as well, you can follow us across our social media. We're actually creating a resource at the moment that will be made available, and it's kind of a guided resource for parents to talk about menstruation with young kids, especially notably with like single dads and maybe like same-sex parents and kind of things like that. So that's something that we're working on. So you can follow us on Anytime of the Month on Instagram. But yeah, my main advice is just start the conversation. That's the only thing I can ever say.
I love it. So talk, listen, allow others to be heard, and get yourself into awkward situations.
Yeah, as awful as it might be, just sit there, enjoy it.
Look at, to echo John Lewis, that amazing man who said, "Good trouble, cause good trouble,
Yeah,
get into trouble."
exactly.
I love it. I hope your organizations, when people find your websites and join your Instagram, have buttons or position to donate, or at least to find out or ask how to donate. So, I mean, you certainly have taught me an awful lot here today. I've heard some of me. I could talk for the rest of the day with all of you. I wanted to give each of you an opportunity. You don't have to take it. If there was anything you wanted to share or say that you hadn't had an opportunity to, just let me know if anybody wants to share anything else. Or yes, please go ahead. Oh, both, great. So Caitlin, we'll start with you.
I found at secondary school who had started the trial for free period products. It's the Loretto Secondary School in Kilkenny, and their student council is to try and make period poverty not a thing in their school. So it was a nice thing to have read about this week.
Thank you very much. Shout out to the Loretto in Kilkenny, where 2 of my nieces attended. Well done, you. Marcy?
I also wanted to recommend Catholics for Choice for people who are in the United States. It's a really great organization. And, just to make it full circle, maternal mortality is really bad in the United States. It's more dangerous to give birth now than it was 30 to 40 years ago, and people don't really seem to get that. And then, of course, the states where abortion is most restricted are also the states where maternal mortality is worse. Abortion is more than just sort of this thing that happens and is necessary. It is part of all pregnancy care. People who have miscarriages, which are also known as spontaneous abortions, require abortion care, the medications that are involved in order to not die of sepsis. So this is a really important, part of truly all of women's healthcare, all of transgender healthcare. And so if you are feeling like it's hard for you to sort of get behind supporting abortion and only abortion, I think it's really worthwhile the investment of drawing the connection between how important abortion is for any pregnancy, if it's wanted or intended or not.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the panel and wish you all continued success with all the work you're doing, and look forward to following you all on your journeys. And that's it. That wraps it up for this portion of the conference. Thank you to everybody who's been listening, and bye.